As you probably heard, there's a big fight between Anthropic and the Department of Defense in the US. Anthropic said, hey, you can't use our technology, you can't use Claude for a variety of purposes, including especially use in autonomous weapon systems and mass surveillance. Pentagon said, you're not going to tell us what to do. Yada, yada, yada. There's a big fight. The US government says, if you don't cave on this, you're out. Anthropic didn't cave. The US government said, okay, you're out of here. Also, you're a supply chain risk. And so it's a crazy thing that's going on right now. I wanted to talk to someone who knew about these things. And so I talked to Michael Horowitz. I'm going to read his bio because it's long and important, because we want to make sure that we're talking to someone who actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to things like the DoD. So Michael Horowitz is director of Perry Worldhouse and Richard Perry Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's a senior fellow for technology and innovation at the Council on Foreign Relations. And prior to returning to the university, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Development and Emerging Capabilities and Director of the Emerging Capabilities Policy Office. He's also the author of The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics. Eminently qualified to have this conversation. I actually did have a conversation with him a few months ago, 6-ish months ago, about the sort of ethical permissibility of autonomous weapon systems. And that was a really interesting conversation because essentially he thinks autonomous weapon systems, as long as they meet certain safety criteria, are arguably ethically preferable to their alternatives, that they are really a further extension of precision weaponry, which we want for ethical and functional reasons. And so it's all else equal on the ethical up and up, which of course goes against the grain of people who think we should never have AI powering autonomous weapon systems. So I reached back out to Michael. I said, hey, let's talk about this. Let me hear your latest take on what's going on between the Pentagon and Anthropic. How does it relate to our earlier conversation, so on and so forth. So that's what we did. I'm recording this on Saturday, February 28th. So this is one day after the US government said, Anthropic, you're out of the DoD. And we talked for about 15 minutes. And as you'll see, he thinks this sort of started as not a dispute about a particular use case, but just a kind of policy difference, although it's not clear how the policy difference really would manifest in actually collaborating. Anyway, so we talk for about 15 minutes. You get Michael's latest take on the situation. And then after that, you'll hear the intro and the full episode of what we recorded back last summer. And that was, I think, the second or third episode of the season. So I'm going to replay it for you because it's a great conversation. And of course, it's particularly relevant on the heels of this conflict. So I hope you enjoy it. All right, so Michael, as you know, that's why we're having this little conversation, this little update to the conversation that we had, I don't know, 6-9 months ago, whenever that was. No, was it 9 months, was it?
Over the
Anyway,
summer.
doesn't
It was
matter.
over the summer.
The point
so
is,
that probably is like getting close to 9 months. I don't know.
okay, so finally, relevance. Okay, the US government says, okay, listen, Anthropic, you're being used throughout the DoD. We want to continue to use you. We also want you to make it the case that we can use Claude Code, whatever it is. We can use your AI tools to engage in order to create and deploy autonomous weapon systems and to engage in surveillance. Anthropic responds, no, we're not doing that. We're going to limit the access to how you can use our tool. Government says, you better let us. Anthropic says, nope, still not going to do it. And then government says, okay, you're out, and OpenAI is in. So that's high level, I think, what's going on. Tell me if I've got some of the details of that wrong. And then I'm, of course, curious about your general view about, is this given your, we titled the episode In Defense of Killer Robot, tongue-in-cheek, but the idea was something like autonomous weapons are generally, all else equal, a good thing because it's a further extension of precision weaponry, which is good because then you actually attack the things that you want to attack and you don't attack the things that you don't want to attack. So you defended the actual moral importance, I think, of autonomous weapon systems. And so I wonder if you also think that there's what Anthropic has a right to do in its capacity as a company distinct from the government. And secondly, what you think it ought to do given, what the actual moral status is of autonomous weapon systems. So that's the lead up. What do you got?
Thanks for having me back on. So much has happened in the last week. And I would say at a very high level, I think that your description of what the dispute has been like between Anthropic and the Pentagon is basically right with one caveat. And the caveat is that there is no current project that the Pentagon wants Anthropic to do that Anthropic has said no to, nor is there a plan for any project, either in that like surveillance category or autonomous weapon system category, that the Pentagon wants Anthropic to do that Anthropic has said no to. This is essentially a theoretical dispute about
Not like a
possible
Project Maven.
future use cases, not a dispute about anything that's going on now. Like Anthropic was the first of the
Mm,
AI labs to get in the door and be like, we want to do classified work. We want to support American national defense. And so it's wild
yeah.
in some ways that this dispute has erupted in from a policy perspective, just because there is no actual policy like disagreement of a thing on the table now, which is why, like, to me, this in some ways is a little more about like personalities in politics, but
Mm,
masquerading as a policy dispute, given that this apparently all started when, after the Maduro raid, an Anthropic staffer called up Palantir and asked whether Anthropic's tools were used as part of the Palantir system called Maven Smart System that
mm,
was reportedly used in the context of the Maduro raid, and that somebody from Anthropic had even asked the question, led to outrage from the Pentagon and triggered this like showdown that ended like yesterday with Anthropic being labeled as a supply chain designation, not a lawyer,
right.
unclear how that stands up in court though.
Yeah.
And the president saying that the government must sever all ties with Anthropic like over a
Yeah.
6 month period.
Yeah. So one question is, how do you know that they have no such plans to do those things? And number two, if they don't have any such plans, mightn't they have such plans in the not too distant future? And then, of course, I imagine some people are going to be listening to you and saying or thinking, "Oh, how naive that he thinks that they're not actually going to do this stuff."
It depends on how you think about this. Like, I think what this reflects is a breakdown in trust, basically, between Anthropic and the government, where Anthropic does not trust that the government will use their technology in the future. And
Right.
the government does not trust that Anthropic won't like pull the plug on collaboration in a sensitive
Mm,
national security situation. In
yeah.
a normal time, then either Anthropic could walk away, frankly, if they don't like the government's terms, or the government could decide not to
Yeah.
have a contract with Anthropic. And like both of them would be within
Right.
their rights to do that. But this
Yeah.
has escalated quickly beyond that. With regard to your question about like projects, I think if there were projects that Anthropic was objecting to now, like, we would have heard about that. Like by
Mm.
this point, that would have been part of the
Anthropic would have
discourse.
said they've asked us to do something in particular that we feel uncomfortable doing. But you're right, they haven't. At least I haven't seen anything, them saying any such thing.
And
It's more
based on my
just
knowledge
this is
of
where our red lines are.
yeah, based on my knowledge of all the players involved here, I feel pretty confident actually that is not the situation
Yeah.
that is going on. With regard to future things, yeah, it is, I guess, in theory plausible that
Yeah.
the government could ask Anthropic to do something in those categories. The government has been adamant that it will not do mass surveillance. Like, side note, mass surveillance violates the Fourth Amendment. Some challenges there regardless.
Sure.
Do I
Yeah.
worry about mass surveillance in an era of AI and how that could turbocharge it? Like, absolutely. But like less as the with the Pentagon as the locus of the problem there. And then in the autonomous weapon system category, the rub here from my perspective is Anthropic is right that their technology isn't ready for prime time in this context. And like, I
Mm.
at least would like to think that I know, given that it was my office that wrote the Pentagon's policy on autonomous weapon systems. And you'd be much more
Mm.
likely to use a bespoke algorithm trained on a very specific data set. Suppose you wanted an autonomous
Not a
system.
large language model.
Yeah, suppose you wanted an autonomous weapon system to be able to, like, I don't know, so hit Chinese fighters or something in the case of like a
Yeah.
US China conflict. You train it on a very specific database of Chinese fighters, like not the slop of the internet. Like I could think of, so like
Right. Right.
Anthropic's
Right.
not wrong that like their tech isn't ready for that. And like the other shame here, frankly, look, as somebody who worked for the Pentagon and so have like views about this, it is a shame from an American national defense perspective that Anthropic even said to the Pentagon, we would be happy to work with you to see how we could use our technology to make it useful for something like autonomous weapon systems. Anthropic's
Yeah.
not leveling a moral objection against autonomous weapon systems. Like, they're saying that basically like the tech isn't good, their tech isn't good enough now. They are correct,
Right.
and they have offered to work with the government to help get it there. And instead, the government's, no, you're fired.
But then why? But they
Yeah, I
do.
know, right?
They characterize themselves. If you look at Modi's statement, Dario Modi, the
Yeah,
CEO,
yeah.
co-founder of Anthropic, it sure as hell looks like moral objections, right? These are ethical red lines for them. I don't know. I don't remember if he uses the word ethical, but when I read it, I certainly, what I remember
Yeah,
certainly had a
yeah.
moral flavor to it.
Look at the statement that they made on Thursday night relative to things that they said in the past. The statement they made on
Mm,
Thursday night got a little more detailed and suggested that They recognize that autonomous weapon systems more or less exist now, and they're
Yeah.
not necessarily opposed to them. They think their
Yeah.
technology is the wrong technology to use for that. And
Yeah.
there's like an element of they're uncomfortable, I think, probably with maybe their technology being used in that, but that's in part a function of the fact that they think that their technology wouldn't be safe, that in the context of an autonomous weapon system, which like again is correct. And that's also why that a system like that, like if you used like if you wanted to plug Claude into a missile and have it try to find like the correct target, you know what that
Yeah.
system would
Yeah.
never do? It would never make it through like the testing and evaluation processes
I
that
was
the
gonna.
Pentagon have.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the sort of key parts of the conversation that we had low those many months ago was any piece of software, AI or not, goes through a tremendous amount of diligence, right? That the Pentagon is going to test it in every possible way until they establish the appropriate benchmark for safety. And if it doesn't pass that benchmark, doesn't reach that benchmark, they're not going to use it. Not necessarily for ethical reasons, but for functional reasons,
Yeah.
right? If it's not safe to use,
Tech that doesn't
you
work
might
isn't
wind
a
up.
good idea for the military.
Right. They want tech that works. And so tech that works is ones that are sufficiently under their control. And
Yep.
so if it's not sufficiently under their control, such that they can't operate it in a safe way, in a functional way, they're just not going to use it. So it sounds to me then that you think this is, maybe you said this slightly differently. It's a dust up over nothing.
It's a
Or
dust
it's a
up
lot of
over the.
posturing of some kind.
Yeah, I think this now that the government is has tagged Anthropic with a label as a supply chain risk that is
Yeah.
normally
Yeah.
reserved for like Chinese companies like Huawei. It is
Yeah.
far
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
than a dust up over nothing. Now this gets to
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
the ability of the government to compel
Yeah.
like private firms to work with them. And because in some ways, like this should be a free market. You have multiple like my preference, personal preference, would be that all of the frontier AI labs were doing classified work to help American national defense. But in theory,
Right.
if one frontier AI lab wants to do some projects but not other projects, then for those other projects, you could have a different frontier AI lab. And that it escalates in some ways is this matter of principle, I think, where the Pentagon is so opposed
Mm.
to the notion of a vendor telling them what to do. And I think from the Pentagon's perspective, this would be like if Lockheed sold the Pentagon a missile and said you could only use it against these countries, but not those countries. That's
Right.
the
Right. Right.
analogy
Right.
I think in
And who the hell
PED.
are you to tell us what to do? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And whereas Anthropic is thinking is thinking about their product less a missile and more like a service,
Mm.
and that this is more of a terms of service kind of issue. But yeah, look,
Yeah.
I go back to the fact that there is no project they disagree about now. Like this dispute didn't need to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's really look like who wins in the dispute between Anthropic and the Pentagon. The winner is China, because who
Mm.
it would like happier who loves it that a company as important as Anthropic with technology as good as Anthropic and as much talent they know is
Yeah.
employed like working for
Yeah.
Anthropic, that like that company might not be working with the Pentagon anymore. China's the one who wins.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Totally agree with you on all that. I think it's a dust up with severe consequences or potentially
Yeah,
severe consequences.
totally.
But the original conflict sounds almost silly by your lights, or something like, I don't know. I want to say it's almost like it's immaturity or it's ego or it's something or it's something
Yeah,
along those
I
lines.
think there is like a little bit of ego and personality here, and like part of it is that I think part of this that we have not figured out yet the correct nomenclature to talk about AI enabled weapon systems or autonomous weapon systems in a
Yep.
way that doesn't, I would say, like drag in lots of other things. Like, here's an example. If you imagine, I probably use this like over the summer, but imagine like a radar guided missile. After a pilot fires a radar guided missile, like that missile is gone. There's no human supervision of that
Right. Right.
missile. There's no human control over
Yep.
that missile. Like, and the U.S. has used missiles like that. Lots of countries around the world have used missiles like that for 40 years. And no one's like raising questions surrounding the like ethics of the system
Yeah.
intrinsically or control of the system
Yeah.
intrinsically. So then when you have people come out and say, all right, we don't want systems that don't have human supervision all the way to the point of impact, like, all right, what are we talking about here? And
Have a
what they
bullet.
think what they're trying to do is ensure there aren't like scary AI weapon systems where an algorithm is deciding like these like large swaths of people like die, or like making choices about whether
Yeah.
somebody's a combatant or like a non-combatant.
Yeah.
But it's actually been really difficult to figure out the right terminology to be able to talk about that without like wrapping in all of these other kinds of things. And if you look at the statement that Dario made on Thursday night, it was actually the closest thing, I think, the closest Anthropic has gotten for my money to like an accurate description in some ways of the state of autonomous weapon systems and their role in this process. I thought OpenAI's statement on Friday night, whether one like agrees or disagrees with whatever, like these like companies or whatever, they used a phrase that I think is actually the absolutely correct way to talk about this, which is saying human responsibility over the use of force, including for autonomous weapon systems. Because to
Hmm.
me, that's the ethical thing here that really matters is that you want human responsibility for the use of force. And you want that whether it's a bow and arrow, whether it's a radar
Yeah.
guided missile, or whether it's some Claude fueled like
Right.
drone that again, like I don't think is ready for prime. I think Anthropic is correct, is not
Yeah.
ready for prime time at all. And
Yeah.
so I hope that there's a way that we can move in a better direction in some ways in how we talk about this to
Yeah.
so we can actually talk about the thing that might be concerning and have a real conversation about it rather than like
Yeah.
wrapping in
Yeah.
all this other stuff by accident.
So at the end of the day, I think you think something like, look, autonomous weapon systems, everything we talked about back in the summer, still all holds true. That autonomous weapon systems, when properly vetted, et cetera, are frankly morally and functionally superior systems to their counterparts. Again, making sure that they're sufficiently vetted against relevant benchmarks for safety, blah 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 blah. And that to the extent that Anthropic is drawing a moral line, it's probably the wrong moral line, unless the moral line is don't it would be wrong ethically functionally to use our stuff as it currently stands in autonomous weapon systems because it's not there yet. That's true, that would be reckless, but a general principled stance against all autonomous weapon systems would be morally
Like
misguided.
I would disagree with that because I think that there are a bunch of use cases like we talked about over the summer. Like for example, if you were in the middle of fighting a conventional war against somebody invading you and you lost access to satellites, how are you going to guide your weapons now?
Yeah,
Having
right.
algorithms that have terrain maps in them that can help then get their way to the target and that have a
Yeah,
seeker that maybe can identify from a target library an appropriate target. It's
yeah,
actually not a
yeah,
terrible idea. And you could lay out a use case that's like totally defensive, like you're defending yourself from invaders in
yeah.
that context. So I think there is like an ethical moral case for them in some instances. Again,
Sure.
presuming that the technology works effectively, which to be clear is a big if, and also gets
Yeah,
back to the point I made earlier about trust, which is that if you don't trust that the Pentagon will use your technology effectively, in some ways, what Anthropic is implying is like
yeah.
maybe they don't trust that some of those processes would go well. But the Anthropic had already made the decision to work with the
Work
Pentagon.
with the DoD.
And if you work with the Pentagon, the business of the Pentagon is war. So you can't be surprised that like you are now part of the war factory, part of the war machine, and you've made the choice
Yeah,
to do
yeah,
that.
yeah. All right, thank you, Michael. Thanks for coming on. Fascinating stuff as always, and yeah, let's see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me again.
Usually, when you hear the phrase killer robots, you think that's a really bad thing. We don't want killer robots. We don't want AI targeting human beings. We don't want AI choosing which targets are the appropriate ones to kill or blow up. And last season, that's exactly what we talked about. I spoke with Rosario Tadeo from Oxford, who argued exactly that. This conversation is the exact opposite. Today, I'm speaking with Michael Horowitz. Michael, and this is a long bio, but it's relevant. He's the director of the Perry World House and Richard Perry Professor at the University of Pennsylvania and a senior fellow for technology and innovation at the Council on Foreign Relations. And before he was a professor, he was a deputy assistant secretary of defense for force development and emerging capabilities and director of the Emerging Capabilities Policy Office. So he's been with the DoD. He's also a professor, and he roughly argues in defense of killer robots. He thinks that's a bit exaggeration, you'll see, but he thinks that it is good to have AI integrated into systems that manifest some degree of autonomy with regards to deciding whether someone should live or die in a military context. The conversation is obviously fascinating, and I think you'll find that It's a compelling case. It's a very compelling case. And so while maybe our instincts are to say, no, AI with the capacity, the autonomy to kill people in warfare, maybe we have the instinct that's terrible. There's good reason to think actually maybe those instincts are all wrong. So that's the topic of this conversation. Obviously, it's extremely fascinating and extremely important, since we really do need to decide what we should allow in a military context and what the real dangers are, since obviously they could be existential. All right, that's what this episode's about. But don't forget to subscribe on Apple or Spotify, buy my book, Ethical Machines. Go to my Substack, readblackman.substack.com. Email me at em@readblackman.com if you have questions, trenchant criticisms, suggestions for guests, or issues you want to hear discussed. And that's it. Let's go talk about killer robots with Michael. So, Michael, if you want to scare someone in talking about AI in a military context, you might talk about killer robots. But you want to, it seems, you want to defend killer robots, whatever that means. And so I guess my first question is, why do you hate humanity so much?
It's a great question. My wife and family ask me that all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's really pro killer robots. It's like a central tenet of pop culture that, like, if you give a robot a brain and a gun, that it decides to destroy all of humanity.
Yeah.
Which I think says more about how we think about ourselves, frankly, than about the like robots like per se. Although like the Murderbot show currently on television, actually,
I think I know that.
Is an accepted, like, spoiler alert for the first 2 minutes of Murderbot. The robot hacks its own system and is free and does not immediately decide to destroy all of humanity.
Does not.
But does not. It might be like the first time besides WALL-E in the history of film and television.
You haven't seen the sequel, though. In the sequel of WALL-E,
Yeah.
he goes apeshit.
Devastating. Yeah, Rambo.
Yeah.
But here's the way I would describe it. I think that we've entered the era of precise mass in war. And by that, what I mean is we used to think about victory and defeat on the battlefield as about having more. Like you have a bigger army, more tanks, more planes, et cetera.
Sure.
And then for the last 40 years, we've been really focused on precision. Radar-guided missiles, heat-seeking missiles, et cetera, all about, instead of mass, let's fire one missile at a specific building in a village after a drone hovers above it for a week when we know there's only one person in there and it's the target.
Yeah.
The challenge is that precision technology is now 4 to 5 decades old. Those precision weapons can cost millions of dollars. And what we see on the battlefield every day with Ukraine, in the context of the war between Ukraine and Russia, suggests that there's a new angle here, that the intersection of AI and autonomy, commercial manufacturing, and basic precision guidance mean that almost anybody around the world now can do precision strike in one way or another. And this is, I think, the most important feature of it. They increasingly need the ability to survive for their weapons to survive in dangerous environments where they can be jammed or hacked or otherwise disrupted. In these kinds of new conventional wars, this isn't the war on terrorism or the forever war. This is a world where you might lose access to satellites, and you need the ability of weapon systems to operate even when you don't have access. And in that way, having more autonomy built into the system gives you the ability to successfully operate even in that communications degraded or denied environment, is I think what an expert might say about that. But more important, you can do this in ways that are 100% consistent with international humanitarian law. Because what we really always want is a human responsible or accountable for the use of force. And that means a human decision maker. The machine doesn't make a decision, the human makes a decision. And you can do that even with an autonomous weapon system. And they can have advantages too. Imagine a world where you have a radar-guided missile, and that radar-guided missile has been launched to try to destroy an enemy radar, and it turns out that radar is on top of a school or on top of a hospital. That radar-guided missile is hitting the school or the hospital. That's super dangerous, and a lot of civilians are going to die. Now imagine instead, there's an algorithm on board. It gets close to the radar and it's like, hey, that radar's on top of a school. Maybe I shouldn't hit not to like anthropomorphize the missile. Maybe I shouldn't hit the radar. And then diverts. We should want our systems to be smart enough to be able to determine what the legitimate targets are after a human has designated that it's legal for them to be able to operate in a given situation.
Okay, this is what this sounds like to me. It's something like this. Don't worry about giving AI military weaponry increased autonomy. I can see the functional argument is really useful because it loses contact with satellites, blah, blah, blah. Get that. Someone might think, oh, you're just going to let it be autonomous, so you're not going to have control over it? Isn't that insanely dangerous and reckless? And your sort of reply that you built in as you articulate that objection was, no, don't worry. There's still going to be plenty of control because we'll be sending it out with such and such algorithms, as you put it, parameters, guidance, instructions, etc., such that it will know how to make decisions the right way because we've told it how to make decisions the right way. So we still have sufficient control such that we are accountable for the goings-on of the AI.
I agree with most of that, except I would push back against the use of the word decision. In that
Okay.
I don't think that the machine in this context is ever making a decision. And in some ways, I think it gives us a lot more control over whether a weapon actually hits its target than before. Here's what I mean. If a human fires a gun, nobody asks, can we control the bullet all the way to impact? If a human fires a radar-guided missile,
Yeah.
there's the school analogy that I mentioned before where you can have a lot of collateral damage. It can be super dangerous. What I'm talking about is a world where you can fire an autonomous weapon system or set of systems, and those systems have been, say, programmed so that the valid targets are, say, the tanks of your adversary. And they get close to where the adversaries are, like the seeker pops open, like, oh, that's a tank.
Yeah.
Hit the tank.
Yeah.
And they can't be jammed and they can't be hacked. And so they're really resilient. And in some ways, they're more likely to be accurate. In some ways, I think the conversation about autonomous weapon systems or killer robots or whatever you want to call them is really a battle of analogies. If what you're talking about is, all right, here's an individual person on the battlefield, on the ground, is that person a okay person to hit? That would be an incredibly difficult thing for any algorithm to be able to do, which is frankly why it's like the last place I think you would imagine seeing autonomous weapon systems on the battlefield.
Yeah.
But if the question is in a less cluttered, say, naval war or air war, or a conflict, a Russia-Ukraine conflict where you have a stable front and Russian tanks, say, are approaching the front line, in that kind of situation, it's not like there are lots of civilians running about and you're trying to figure out, is this human a valid target? It's, oh, there's a fighter jet. And it's not our fighter jet. That's a valid target.
Right.
And in that kind of situation, in some ways, it's about the alignment between what the technology can do and what you're asking it to do. And the important thing is to keep that alignment in check. And I think the technology has reached a level where there are some scenarios where autonomous weapon systems can be incredibly useful. And we see evidence of that in Ukraine every day.
Let me offer two lines of thought. One line of thought is, I don't know that the comparison with the bullet is the right comparison. Do we ask how much control you're exerting over the bullet after you've hit? And I think that's because we're pretty decent at predicting where it's going to go. It's going to go straight, barring some godlike wind. It's going to go fairly straight. And we might miss, our aim might not be completely accurate, but we exhibit, I would say, a high degree of control over the trajectory of that bullet or where that bullet ends up. Not complete. So it's not as though we're talking about control, yes or no. It's degrees of control. And I think what most people are going to say with the bullet is we have sufficient control over where that bullet ends up such that we've got no problem assigning responsibility to the person who shot it. We feel done our due diligence on gun safety such that we know how to use it safely, et cetera, et cetera. And then I take it that this is a bit bizarre. If you had a gun and the bullet quasi-magically, or maybe just magically, zigzagged a lot, and sometimes it zigs, sometimes it zagged, and eventually tries to get to where you're aiming it, you might be a little bit more hesitant to say, oh, yeah, you've got sufficient control over that bullet such that blah, 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 blah. And I wonder if people think, I'm not sure if this is justifiable, that the degree of control you have over an autonomous system is more like a zigzaggy bullet where, yeah, it's got some end destination and you're aiming for it, but because it can zig and zag in so many unpredictable ways, that makes it the case that it's not as, your due diligence is not as done as it is with, say, shooting a gun. You do have a higher standard in order to deploy the autonomous AI. Does that analogy make sense?
That totally makes sense. I think that in some ways this is all a play on the way that militaries do testing and evaluation. Like, frankly, the weakest point in the claim I just made is that if you think that militaries are going to cut corners in the way that they test their systems, then you could have your the zigzaggy bullet equivalent, and then it won't work, and that would be a bad idea. But I would posit that that's not a bad idea because it's autonomous or AI enabled or whatever term we want to use. It's bad because it's a bad weapon. When I say this, I've served in the U.S. Department of Defense. I've not served in any other militaries, and so I'm only familiar with the American process in great detail. But the Defense Department is the largest bureaucracy in the world, arguably, and the testing and evaluation process for weapon systems is extremely detailed in that any weapon system needs to meet specific standards. And so suppose you were going to deploy an autonomous weapon system that was something like a missile, like a really fancy, really smart missile, essentially. That missile would need to pass the same kind of reliability testing as any other kind of missile. Or to use your example, if you were going to fire a zigzaggy bullet, like an AI-enabled zigzaggy bullet, that gun in that process would have had to go through the same testing as firing an M16 or something like that. So by the time anybody actually uses it on the battlefield, it's reliable. Because frankly, weapon systems that aren't safe don't work. And weapon systems that don't work aren't useful for military commanders, military operators. None of them want to deploy systems that don't work on the battlefield.
This reminds me of the Future of Life Institute. That doesn't exist anymore.
They exist.
They do. One of them doesn't exist anymore. Anyway, they put out a video. Maybe it was them. I think it was them. They put out a video that was meant to show how we get to catastrophe. Some AI system launches something without sufficient oversight, and it causes the enemy to also launch nuclear weaponry in reply, and now we're all dead. But what was so funny, I thought it was comical in a way, because when they were telling the story in the video about how the military came to acquire the weapon, it was like a plucky startup pitching at a conference table, and the military brass it, and they go, yeah, that's great, thumbs up. And that's the procurement process. That's how the procurement process is represented in the video. And it's, of course, if it were like a plucky startup talking to a couple of people in the military, and they liked their pitch, and now they onboard AI nuclear weaponry, that would be really worrying. But presumably, to your point, the procurement process is slightly more rigorous than that.
And just to be clear, if you don't think that the procurement process is rigorous and you don't think it delivers systems that it can do the things that they say that they're going to do, then absolutely, that there would be greater risk. And I think a counter argument to the point that I just made would be what if you're fighting a war and then you cut corners to speed something onto the battlefield? My answer to that would be that totally happens. But again, that's not about the AI. Because that happens with lots of systems. Look at the way that, say, Ukraine is updating the software in their weapon systems on a weekly basis, or sometimes even faster than that, because they're trying to evade Russian jamming and building more AI into those systems to try to make them more effective. They're facing an existential threat in reacting accordingly, and we'd probably do the same thing.
So let me ask you this about the due diligence testing or the safety testing. How feasible is it that it gets done sufficiently comprehensively? What I'm thinking of is autonomous systems. You painted it as a lot of these things are coarse-grained scenarios where it's a fighter jet, or it's not a sort of gray area case. It's not a fog of war type situation. Yes, you made it easy for yourself. But the fog of war is shit's crazy. And sometimes, yes, it's clear. That's a fighter jet. It's not ours. Fire. Fine. But I take it that one of the issues is things get extremely complicated on the ground. Things get very fuzzy, and they get fuzzy in, I would think, fairly unpredictable ways. And so in order to do safety testing of the autonomous system, you're going to have to, simulate all the ways in which the fuzzy things might occur, the set of all fuzzy things, and then blah, blah, blah. There's just so many variables. I guess I don't have a good grip on how would a military or anyone even go about comprehensive safety testing, given all the novel situations in which an autonomous system might find itself.
Absolutely. Now imagine how hard it is to train a person to think through those situations and all the mistakes that people make in war. when people get angry and people get tired, or there's a situation on the battlefield that somebody isn't prepared for.
Yeah.
And those definitively lead to like challenges in war. And one of the reasons, one of the main reasons the US military is the best in the world is because our people are the best in the world. If what you're worried about is, all right, like what if your data is poisoned? What if there's a scenario the algorithm hasn't encountered? What if there's pixelated camouflage in a way that distorts how accurate your algorithm is?
Yeah.
Those are all things that you could know about and test for. But this in some ways is a question of how you build the fail-safe on those kinds of systems. Like in theory, a smart way to build those kinds of systems would be, all right, like what do you do if you're confused? The answer should be back off in that kind of case, unless you are in like a, you know, like the enemy is coming over the hills, like invade. That's like a different kind of situation. But I also think that in some ways, like this is a case where it's so hard for us to grasp some of these kinds of situations because we're so used to the use of force scenarios that we encountered in the Forever War. Yeah. Whereas, like we have a week while an MQ-9 Reaper hangs around this like village waiting for like the 1 minute this militant like goes into a house and their family is gone and there's nobody else in the house and whatever. And that's not what the war that say like Russia and Ukraine are fighting like looks like.
Yeah.
And we need to be ready for those kinds of conflicts.
Yeah. Okay. So you answered the question in two ways. I actually think I like the first one more than the second one. The first thing, they're both legit, actually. The first one is humans are also confused in situations as well. And so then it's not a sort of monitoring issue or a fail-safe issue. Then it's what's the benchmark here? The issue is not can we get perfection out of the autonomous system. The issue is can we get something like on average better results with the autonomous system than we can with the people. And since people make all sorts of mistakes, what we need to do is first measure how shitty people are in confusing situations and then see how they reply, figure out how to measure such a thing, and then put autonomous systems in at least simulated situations that are like those and see if they perform better or worse than the humans. And then, it might be the case that there are situations in which a human would perform better than the autonomous system, but if on average, or something along those lines, the autonomous system outperforms the human in complex, foggy, confusing situations, then that looks like a pretty compelling reason to prefer the autonomous system over the people.
I would say that like for folks that are really worried about autonomous weapon systems, their concern is that militaries will accept performance that is not as good as humans. Yeah. In some ways, like I think I have more faith in how at least a military like the United States would make those decisions.
Yeah.
And so and at least the standard that like I would use would be a system that is as good or better than what a human could do in a given situation, which frankly is what militaries should be incentivized to use. Because again, if it's not that good, it's going to be less effective. And then why would you use it?
So here's a reason. I'm not sure how compelling it is, but suppose I could see someone giving the following kind of argument. Yeah, look, it's not quite as good as people. We don't want to lose lives. Better to lose metal than it is to lose lives. Yeah, is it more inefficient? Yeah. It's not as good, not as impactful as humans, but I'll take the lower efficiency for greater lives saved if we could throw more money at it, more AI at it to make up for its relative inferiority to people. How about that?
That's totally reasonable, except I think this in some ways goes back to my belief that some of these like really complicated ground warfare scenarios where maybe you're like literally trading is a person knocking on the door versus like some kind of machine or something like that, like where you have that kind of trade-off. That's the last kind of place you would use an autonomous weapon system on the battlefield, simply because it would be such a confusing environment that it'd be difficult for those kind of systems to be as good or better than a human. Yeah. It's why we're more likely, I think, like when I say that, I think that we've entered the era of precise mass, and this is a world in which like lots of people can now do this. Yeah. And a country like the United States has no choice somewhat but to respond. It's because of the way that I think this plays out in more sort of conventional war environments where everybody's in agreement that like, hey, the bad guys are over there, like we have to go fight. Yeah. Which I realize is like a little bit of a cop-out to like the point that you're making, but I don't disagree with you. I just think those are the kind of scenarios in which we're least likely to use those kinds of AI-enabled capabilities.
Let me ask you a different kind of question now. So we're focused on the case in which we're asking, should we use the autonomous system or should we use a bunch of humans or something along those lines? Or just non-autonomous systems, doesn't matter. And what if I ask a different kind of question that's about something like the set of autonomous systems? Maybe I'm worried about, I'm not sure what I'm worried about. Or what, I think I might be worried about the scale of potential destruction or something along those lines, or errors being amplified. When a human screws up, the scale of the screw up is, unless they have their finger on the button, relatively minor. But since AI acts at scale, it's going to do what it does at scale, I would think. You might think that having a bunch of AIs is way more dangerous than a bunch of humans. And so it's not the kind of, it's the impacts of the whole as opposed to any particular part of the whole.
Totally reasonable point.
Okay.
I think in some ways then that's not a question of an autonomous weapon. I would pivot a little bit to say that I think your concern is not unreasonable, that you could imagine a world in which if you have a bunch of different AI systems stacked on each other and you're not sure exactly how they interact with each other, does that then, like, essentially that would increase your error rate. Now, in theory,
Sure.
The testing of the systems would help you address that. What we're talking about then in some ways there are a couple angles here. Like one is, it sounds to me like what you were talking about essentially are AI decision support systems combined with what would be AI-enabled weapons on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And the question then is, like, where is the human in the process? And that
Sure.
like, I'm positing in some ways, or at least the scenario that I would defend, is one where there is a responsible and accountable human, which means you have trusted confidence that the systems are going to operate the way that they're supposed to.
Yeah.
I actually worry a bit about countries that are not the United States and that don't trust their people as much as we do. How the logic of control, say, in an authoritarian military might lead to, in some ways, the kind of situation that you're worried about, where you cut people out because you didn't trust them in the first place. So if you trusted your people in the first place, maybe you have a different kind of government, frankly.
Yeah.
And so there's an authoritarian logic to that kind of layering that I'm a little less worried about in at least a military like the United States. That's part one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would say part two is, if, on the other hand, I totally misinterpreted your question, and what you're really worried about is, but couldn't that swarm go out there and be autonomous and do really bad stuff? Then the answer is, in theory, I guess, but that thing just, to me, comes back to, how effectively has this thing been tested?
Yeah.
And do you actually have trusted confidence that it works the way that it's supposed to? And if you don't, you shouldn't be deploying it.
Yeah. I guess my question in my head is really the structure of a question as opposed to a question in a way. What I have in mind are things like, so suppose we say, let's say it's ethically permissible for a single individual to, I don't know, toss a single piece of plastic into the ocean or something along those lines, or to drive a car and create the amount of pollution that a car creates. So that's ethically permissible. We say, is that ethically permissible for Michael or Reed to drive their car and blah, blah. Of course it is. But then you take this set of ethically permissible actions and you wind up with an ethical outcome that is not good for anyone, let's say. So that's the case with pollution. There's lots of other kinds of cases where there's individual actions that are ethically permissible but add up to a sum of actions that has a bad impact. So I guess I'm just wondering if there's a kind of analogous case here where we say, yeah, look, it's ethically permissible in this case to use an autonomous system to shoot down those planes or to identify that building instead of a person. But I wonder if the set of ethically permissible actions of preferring the autonomous system over the human leads to some situation that is analogous to climate change or something like that.
I am less worried about that, I think, in some ways, because I am less worried about in some ways, because I'm confident in the ability of military bureaucracies to stymie that kind of situation. Mm-hmm. And or put another way, from a U.S. perspective, I'm much worried about the U.S. going too slowly and adopting these technologies then too quickly, which I realize takes an abstract point that you made. It makes it concrete about one military, which is obviously
that's what I wanted you to do.
Which is convenient for the point that I'm making. But by that, what I mean is if you're talking about a bureaucracy where everybody's been trained their entire career to operate a certain way and to have humans involved in lots and lots of different parts of the process, I think that the incentives are more toward those individual use cases happening. I think in some ways, the burden of proof is on and whether it should be this way is a different question. The burden of proof is on, I think, something like an autonomous weapon system in a military bureaucracy like the United States, because the bias in some ways is against it. And so I'm less worried about that kind of aggregation over time. Look, on the other hand, if what you're telling me is that the technology is improved to the level where these systems are just fundamentally better than humans in all of those individual cases, then the question becomes, then what kind of human oversight do you have over that system?
Yeah.
And if the human oversight of that system still means that if something goes awry, you can point to that commander said the mission was okay, and that commander was supposed to, what the U.S. Department of Defense calls appropriate human judgment over the use of force, then as long as you have that, it's not clear that there's necessarily a problem there. The problem would be if you have lots and lots of unanticipated behaviors that happen in a way that nobody had planned for.
Yeah.
Where it went from, think about this as going from 0 to 60 as opposed to crawl, walk, run.
Yeah. Okay, I have two kinds of questions in mind. One is, do you think that, given that different units of the military would be using different autonomous systems, is there a kind of an orchestration problem or an orchestration issue that doesn't exist when we're not talking about autonomous systems? Because each different units are sending out different autonomous systems that are doing different things, and we may have tested each individual autonomous system and it's sufficiently safe, but we haven't tested it when it interacts with another autonomous system, either of the same kind or of a different kind. So one, is there an orchestration problem which makes, and if so, or just doesn't that just generally make controlling the AIs more complicated than controlling non-autonomous systems? That's one question. The other question is, these autonomous systems go through this really complex internal supply chain where one company or one unit or one team made this part of the AI system, another part made this part of the AI system, another part made this part of the AI system, another. So it's just this it's a very complicated whole where different people are responsible for different parts. And this speaks to the accountability issue of, okay, so if things go sideways, how do we assign responsibility given that the thing is composed of all these parts and where each part was made as the result of hundreds, thousands of decisions across dozens, hundreds of teams? So I guess those were two very different questions.
Yeah. No, those are both really good questions. I think the first one, to me, you wouldn't want to use these systems in combination on the battlefield unless you had tested beforehand.
Yep.
To the extent that this is not a case of practice makes perfect, more like practice makes permanent, or the way you practice is the way that you play. If you're going to use systems that would interact with each other on the battlefield, you would certainly want to test that beforehand to understand how they interact. Yeah. There might be some level of unpredictability there that's intrinsic, but that's also true in a non-autonomous world. Where you have, say, a Marine unit, an Air Force unit, and an Army unit all converging on a spot on the battlefield. They all have maybe slightly different orders, and you're counting on their understanding of the situation to deconflict and ensure you achieve an outcome. Yeah. In many cases, what we're macro often talking about here, though, is human-machine teaming. Not just you're sending the robots and the robots are going to take the hill. Yeah. And in that human-machine teaming situation, you still have Marines out there. You still have folks out there. And so I think that at least in theory, helps address that along with the testing, in theory, testing how you would play. Yeah. Sorry, remind me the second question again.
I will in a second. but first I want to say, I think your answer is a fair one, because earlier we were saying that, look, you want to compare the autonomous system against a human. How poorly do humans act when they're confused? Does the AI or autonomous system act any more poorly when it's quote unquote confused? And so the relevant benchmark is not perfection, but human error rate, something along those lines. And what I was trying to draw attention to with the orchestration issue is a kind of skepticism about our ability to comprehensively engage in safety assessments, or to engage in comprehensive safety assessments. And your point was, what's the benchmark? The relevant benchmark is not, 100% comprehensive safety assessment because that's not even possible in
that-
any other area. So the question really is it sufficiently comprehensive such that we have sufficient confidence to give a green light decision or something along those lines? And then what counts as sufficient is going to depend upon, at least in part, what counts as sufficient in a non-autonomous scenario as well. So the thresholds can stay the same.
And this is actually, I think, an important distinction that matters, at least from a U.S. perspective. If you look at the U.S. Department of Defense's sort of definition of an autonomous weapon system and policy on autonomous weapon systems, part of a key part of that, it's not just about the technology, it's also about how you use it. You could lob a weapon out there that essentially you're not, you could lob a weapon out there that ends up being an autonomous weapon system, even though it wasn't designed for that. This is essentially about where the technology meets your concept of operation, like how you plan to use the technology. And you need to plan to, it both needs to be capable of being autonomous and you need to actually plan to use it autonomously. So your second question, which I remembered now, it was about essentially all the different things that go into a system and how you would then determine accountability or responsibility. To me, I'm going to go back on to the question of what accountability looks like in that non-autonomous scenario. So imagine, say, there's a helicopter crash. There's a tragic helicopter crash. A couple of military personnel die. There'll be an inquest. So there'll be a process trying to figure out what happened. And what are they trying to look for then? They're trying to look for, all right, did the pilots make a mistake? Did they get bad information about what was happening? Was there a mechanical error? And then if there was a mechanical error, was it a mechanical error that was in some ways acceptable because there is some sort of error rate for whatever the system is, or maybe a mechanic should have caught it before the helicopter actually got in the air? Or was this an error that no one had heard before, no one had prepared for, but the manufacturer should have known about and told people about? And I think you would end up going through the same process for an AI-enabled system on or close to the battlefield, which is if there was a tragic accident, you would then try to figure out, all right, did the system do what it was supposed to? And what it was supposed to do led to, say, civilian harm? Or did the system not do what it was supposed to? And if it didn't do what it was supposed to, is that because it got bad data? In which case, is that the fault of the system, or is that the fault of whatever got it the data? Or was it an actual information processing sort of issue, so on board, with a chip? And the process of figuring out accountability, which is already well established in cases of accidents and things like crashes, or if a ship runs aground or something like that, I think a military would go through the same process. I think one of the things that ends up confusing about this, or difficult about this, and why it's so important to have these kinds of conversations, is that the folks that normally do that stuff, those are not AI experts. And the AI community are not super well trained in how militaries do accident investigations.
Of course,
But when really you need both of those bodies of knowledge then to be able to do that effectively.
Okay, I take it that this whole conversation started with the implicit idea, or somewhat explicit, which is that precision weapons are good. And they're good because they tend to harm the people that we think ought to be harmed and don't harm the people that we think ought not to be harmed. So there's something strongly in favor of precision weapons, and this is a kind of further manifestation of precision weaponry, something along those lines.
Yeah, more or less. When you think about precision, when we tend to talk about precision from an ethical or philosophical perspective, we talk about it more in terms of reducing collateral damage, reducing civilian harm. But why did the U.S. military invent precision weapons in the first place? So they could hit targets more accurately. The reason for precision was not the OG for precision is not civilian harm. The OG is if you can drop one bomb to destroy a target as opposed to 10 or 100, all the better. The issue now is that the one bomb you drop is super expensive. And if you could fire maybe 10 things, each of which costs 5% of the cost of that one bomb, using cheaper manufacturing and some AI capabilities on board, then now you're it requires thinking about the use of force differently. But if you can keep that accuracy, but now generate the same effect at lower cost by firing a few more things, then there's potentially opportunity there. And the rest of the world is doing that. It's not like we have this and nobody else does, which was more like the case we thought about in the 90s.
So I take it that most of the objections or most of the considerations that we've talked about so far have to do with something like, are you sure you can have sufficient control over the thing? Are you sure that this isn't going to go totally sideways in an unexpected way? Or it's something like, we're not sure enough. And your point has constantly been to say, yeah, look, there's plenty of empirical reason to think that it'll be tested in all the ways that all the other things have been tested, and it'll meet the appropriate risk thresholds and blah, 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 blah. That's been the point so far. There's another line of argument, which I know you're familiar with, and I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to say to this, but I'll ask you anyway. There's some people who are, I think they're just opposed to an autonomous system killing people, something along those lines.
Totally.
That it's somehow contrary. You can see that I don't really get the thrust of this argument, so I might ask you to.
No, there's some like inherent human dignity that's violated by an autonomous weapon system.
I'm going to start off saying there's a yuck factor that I understand, but the reason that I don't really feel the pull is precisely because of something that you said earlier, which is, look, we're still programming the AI to act in this way in such and such contexts. And it's still, if you like, our decision for it to kill person X in situation Y. So when the autonomous system does it, it's not, as you said earlier, making a decision to kill someone. I don't. So is that your view? Something like,
yeah, I think that's basically right. I also think that the sort of what I would call maybe the human dignity objection to something like an autonomous weapon system. I think there's two issues I would call out maybe in that context beyond what you said.
Yeah.
One is that these systems, if they work effectively, and this is, to be clear, is like a very like utilitarian like argument, then it's not clear to me if what we are talking about is fighting a war where like things are destroyed and people die. Mm-hmm. It's not clear to me that there's something like inherently wrong there, especially if there's still a human that is responsible for the use of force. Mm-hmm. If you pull the human out completely from responsibility, then that's a different like kind of situation.
Mm-hmm. But then the objection would be the person who decided to pull the human out altogether. And then
you could always like trace back accountability in some way if like you really wanted to. But I also think that there's sometimes a failure to understand how autonomous modern weapons are already. So there's an air-to-air missile called the AIM-120 or the AMRAAM. It like a very stylized description of how like an AMRAAM works essentially is, imagine like you're a pilot, you're flying a plane, and over the horizon, so you can't see it, you get a ping that you believe is an adversary airplane. Yep. You can't see that airplane. You then press a button, you fire the missile. When the missile gets like close enough, it opens up a seeker. That seeker is not like an algorithm programmed with a target library or something. Mm-hmm. It's got maybe it's like radar seeking and but it's got some, imagine like dumb smart technology. Essentially.
It's like photo recognition software?
So,
and it recognizes that? No.
Not photo recognition would be much more than what your average like air-to-air weapon would have.
Okay.
And then, so imagine like your sensor opens. Let's just, for simplicity's sake, let's call it like, say it's like radar guided. The adversary plane has its radar on. You turned on your seeker, like the missile turns on its seeker, the radar's like on, and the pilot who fired the missile like watches as their missile then like watches like the blip of their missile hit the blip of the plane.
Yeah, sure.
And then there are no blips. The pilot never saw the adversary.
Yeah.
Like didn't know for sure, except that like they know that they're like fighting a war and that it's like legal for them to fire.
Yeah.
And for them to fire a weapon.
Yeah.
Maybe if they had figured, depending on how exactly the system works and what the like rules of engagement are.
Yeah.
Maybe if they at the last minute, if they discovered that it wasn't actually an adversary, they could call off the missile. Yeah. But maybe not, frankly. And so there's a lot of autonomy built into that system. Mm-hmm. And the judgment role of the human in some ways is one of trust in the system and their training to know when you're supposed to fire or not. Mm-hmm. And like that in some ways is the special sauce in a way that I don't think goes away, even with most of what the like realistic kinds of autonomous weapons that you would use on the battlefield. But when you put it in that context, I think this seems a lot, it could be scary or not scary, but it's a lot less different than the sort of semi-autonomous systems that are deployed with regularity today.
It feels like Your response to the objection is that the person who lobbies the objection has a mental model of what warfare looks like that's unrealistic.
Fundamentally, yeah.
Okay. Then no, that's yeah.
I mean, look, I'm just being like blunt and honest. But here's another way to think about it, though. If you look at and I'm sure somebody will write in to complain about this, the point that I'm about to make. If you think about where there's a NGO group called the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots.
Yeah.
That their mission is obvious from the title.
Yeah.
If you look at where the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots came from and where some of the countries that were first describing concerns about some of these capabilities were coming from, they were really concerned with drone strikes, which are remotely piloted. And in some ways, their view that some of those strikes were illegal, they're like, it would be even worse if that MQ-9 Reaper just had an algorithm. It was like, oh, like that person's a bad guy. Now we can kill them. What started this in some ways started like some of this conversation was a very specific use case in some ways that folks objected to, but the cat was out of the bag already on drone strikes, and they were looking at what was next that would be of greatest concern.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues is that it turns out that the kinds of use cases that are most likely for autonomous weapon systems are actually not the one that initial NGO folks had in mind. The actual use cases are much more like conventional, like something in the Indo-Pacific between the US and China, or something between Russia and Ukraine, rather than like attacks against militant groups.
Yeah. Let me ask you one last question, I think, which is something like, where does all this end? Or maybe end is too ominous. Where does all this go? I have a feeling that, let's say the people of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, I imagine that something that they would say is something like, if all the countries start using all these autonomous systems, things are going to go just super sideways. I imagine they're thinking existential risk kind of stuff. So it's just one military will throw their robots at the other military, will throw their robots, and it's going to be a war of the robots against robots, and this is just going to lead to an insane level of destruction. You add to that things like the speed at which AI makes quote unquote, makes decisions is insanely fast. We can't possibly monitor it, not the decision making in real time, given the speed. Especially if it's interacting with other AIs, including enemy AIs, the speed of warfare has to increase at something like an exponential rate, or at least a rate that's too fast for us to really audit in real time or monitor in real time. And what about that? And this actually speaks back to my pollution kind of case.
That's the best version of your pollution argument.
So what's the response to the best version?
I would say two things. One, I actually wrote a whole article about how that if one was going to be worried, like that would be the thing to be worried a little more about, which essentially the speed trap of too much autonomy on the battlefield. But I think in some ways that is less an autonomous weapon system issue. It's more if AI decision support becomes AI decision making. I think the issue is, or not the issue, the reason why I am personally less worried about that, at this point, I don't think that's coming to a movie theater near you, or maybe it's only coming to a movie theater near you in the short term, or even potentially in the medium term. There's a lot to work out with how these systems actually operate. Yeah. And I think we're a lot more likely to see if you think about a weapon system more at the tactical level of war, and the kind of risks that you're talking about involve more, if you were overseeing lots of different forces on the battlefield, more the operational level of war. To totally turn that over to an AI would imply a degree of confidence in the performance of that system that so far exceeds what existing sort of technology, looks like. If that technology is so good that it's way better than humans from all of the testing and evaluation, then hey, maybe we should just praise our robot overlords. I think we are less likely functionally to see that on the battlefield, with one caveat. I do worry about those kinds of risks more, and I previewed this before, when it comes to more autocratic countries. Because I think that due to their lack or what is often, not always, what in some ways is an intrinsically lower level of trust in their people.
Sure.
And in their personnel, The like logic in a country like the United States and in most democratic countries is human machine teaming. Like our people are great. We use technology to make our people better. Maybe even there are fewer people, but the role of technology is to enhance, especially when it comes to making choices or decisions.
Yeah.
The role of technology is to enhance the ability of the people to make good decisions. If you don't trust your people, you might be more likely to cut more and more of them out of the decision-making loop.
Yeah.
Which is actually why, like, the thing I worry about the most in this kind of scenario is actually not like killer robots run awry on the battlefield in a way that leads to a flash crash war sort of scenario.
Yeah.
It's more an autocratic country using autonomy to cut people out of the loop for purposes of like mass domestic repression and destruction. That one of the key checks against the ability of autocrats to essentially like murder lots of their citizens historically is the army eventually says no. But if you can cut more and more people out of that, like that to me is a scenario I'm much more worried about than the like conventional war, like autonomous weapon systems interacting and then like disaster strikes.
Yeah. I hear you on the totalitarian state clamping down on citizens. I guess when it comes to that other scenario that you're less worried about, I could see someone giving a kind of slippery slope argument, but this isn't that, that's not this, and that, and then we're in a hellscape. So then my question to you is something like, what would be a plausible milestone for us to look out for? Or a threshold, like, okay, we've hit this point in the development. Maybe it's going to be in 5 years, maybe it's going to be in 10 years, maybe it's going to be in 50 years. I don't know. But here's a milestone where we would want to say, hold on a second. Have we slipped too far down the slope? What would that milestone look like?
I will say, just like philosophically, I don't love slippery slope arguments, but but to play along, because why not? You
could reject the whole thing. It's not a slippery slope. There's already a hard and fast line.
I don't think it's necessarily that there's
no issue here.
I think I get the point that you're making. In the U.S. military, there are combatant commands, like Indo-Pacific Command, like Northern Command, like European Command, like like African Command, et cetera.
Sure.
Central Command, like covering the Middle East. If you had a situation in which the judgment of the commander of, say, Indo-PACOM was no longer the primary factor making decisions surrounding military operations. Yeah. And instead, it was essentially like an AI, and the commander is just like literally just pressing a button, agree or not.
Yeah.
That's a situation in which, like, the level of testing you need to do that, unbelievable from like where I sit. But if you were going to be worried about that, that's like the point at which I would have might have a little more concern. I just don't think that's the vision for how at least a country like the United States will use these kinds of systems.
Yeah, okay, so let me just slightly rephrase. There are people who say, oh, there's going to be an AI CEO of a company. And so your point is something like, in the military context, that would be the milestone or the red flag or the holy shit moment. But secondly, while the odds of that happening in a business context are not that slim in a way, some people are claiming to do it. In the military context, it's extraordinarily unlikely. So there's a milestone, and it's extraordinarily unlikely that we'll ever hit it.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair.
Cool. Michael, this has been super fascinating. Thanks so much for coming on, and thanks for defending the killer robots. Because if you don't stand up for the killer robots, who will?
Somebody has to.
Somebody has to, exactly. This is what I've been saying.
Just to be clear, I don't...
No,
it's not standing up for the killer robots. A lot of the arguments against them are just not based in the reality of how military technology and military process works.
Yes, no, I hear that point loud and clear. And I'm sympathetic. I'm launching objections, but I'm broadly sympathetic to the view. So thanks for coming on.
Great, you can join me in the pro-killer robots camp.
Yeah, we'll do the other nonprofit, the Campaign for Killer Robots.
Campaign for Killer Robots? I don't know. That doesn't really roll off the tongue in the same way.
I think it's got a nice ring to it. Ominous, but it's a ring.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wassilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.